We're going to move the conversation along to what we now know is the moral injury. And as I alluded to earlier, that the moral injury was coined by Dr. Jonathan Shea of the Boston VA after his work with Vietnam veterans who there was a persistent obstacle that they could not seem to get through or get over or get by with traditional types of psychotherapeutic interventions and medications. The moral injury, by definition, is a construct that describes an unprecedented life experience, including harmful aftermath of exposure to such events. Events are considered morally injurious if they transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And if you remember the story that I started with about the founding of Warrior's Journey Home, the young man that I referenced had grown up in the Episcopal Church. He served in different youth groups and choirs and had that moral upbringing, that moral fiber and values instilled within him, not only from his family, but also by his faith community and by his nation to various degrees. And so when he's placed in a situation, as many veterans are, or soldiers are, or sailors, or airmen, or Marines, we are oftentimes put into situations where our personal values and ethics and morals are compromised, have to be compromised. One of the things that I do for my definition, which is a little more of a Reader's Digest version, is when the noble cause for which you were called to is compromised by circumstances, orders, or situations. The result is a moral injury. Part of that is the betrayal by the chain of command sometimes, and I've spoken with women veterans who have been subjected to sexual harassment or rape by someone within their military unit, and the chain of command refuses to deal with it. And that's a betrayal and results in a moral injury. Another situation very similar to that to illustrate the point, and then I'll move on, is there was a soldier who would not fire his weapon at an enemy because he thought the taking of life was immoral. And so in a firefight, he would not fire his weapon, or if he did fire, he would not aim at anyone. And he felt that he had betrayed his comrades and betrayed his fellow soldiers because he was not an effective battle buddy. But he was put in that situation, and think about that if you're 19 or 20 years old, what that was like. What I like to do is connect the moral injury with the spiritual emergency. And spiritual emergency was coined by Stan and Christina Groff in the 1980s. It's a radical personality transformation and spiritual opening. If what we do in Warrior's Journey Home is we look at the moral injury and a spiritual crisis as a spiritual opening, because inevitably what has happened, and been my experience, is that when we go through these events, what we had before doesn't work to bring us comfort or wellness or healing, or allows us the opportunity to speak in meaningful ways. We don't have a language for it. So this spiritual crisis that we encounter gives us a spiritual opening as well. And if we think about it long enough and we work through this, it can cause us to emerge and rise to a level of functioning and spiritual awareness. So I don't necessarily see the psycho-spiritual crisis as something that is extremely negative. The psycho-spiritual crisis begins after the traumatic emotional experience. Happens after that. So in my experience, this has been sometimes months or years following an incident, which would be a spiritual crisis, before we begin to see this as a moral injury. We have the science, and I'm very, very grateful for Dr. Avon's model of treatment and the multiple treatment protocols that are available, and how do we work together to bring these things together. Another way that I've found also is dogmatic religion, which I also find to leave a lot to be desired when we address the moral injury and the spiritual crisis. And so these things we're going to deal with superficially today, but something that we could do perhaps later on in a deeper thing. Moral injuries may stem from direct participation in acts of combat, such as killing or harming others, or indirect acts, such as witnessing death or dying, or failing to prevent immoral acts of others, giving or receiving orders that are perceived as gross moral violations. The act may have been carried out by an individual or group through a decision made individually or as a response to orders given by your leaders in the chain of command. The slide that you see here is a familiar slide. That is Kim Puck, South Vietnamese born, now lives in Canada. She's a naturalized citizen in Canada. This was taken outside the village of Trang Bang in 1972, June 8th, 1972. Kim is 9 years of age. Now the backstory on this, and this resulted in a moral injury for one of our pilots, and actually the bomb that was dropped on Trang Bang was a South Vietnamese pilot in an American aircraft. This is Kim here. This is her older brother, and this is her younger brother. Because it was so late in the war, 1972, by 1973 we had stopped sending troops to Vietnam. The war was officially over in 1975, so this was towards the end of the war. In 1972, the standard operating procedure was that if you left an airfield with bombs and explosive, with ordnance, you were not permitted to land with that ordnance. You had to get rid of that ordnance somewhere. And so the operating procedure in Vietnam was that we give you a specific grid, specific location where you could drop your bombs, and then you could safely land your aircraft. The pilot that I'm going to tell you about is a Warrior's Journey Home member. He's a personal friend of mine. And when he saw this photo of Kim Puck, who had her clothing burned from her body because of a bomb that was dropped on her village, he got with his wingman and said, "I'm not dropping my ordnance. I'm going to land with it." Because the military targets were becoming few and far in between, but they would still launch daily loaded with high explosive ordnance. And so he landed his airplane refusing the orders to drop his ordnance in a certain grid because he didn't want to drop his bombs on innocent civilians. He didn't want to drop his bombs in an area where he didn't know what it was going to hit. That was his moral injury. It also cost him his career. He had planned on staying in the military as a career. But because he refused to drop bombs, he lost his job and got railroaded out of the military. In 2018, on a trip to Vietnam, Warrior's Journey Home conducted a healing circle and ceremony at this very site that you're looking here with Kim. And I met Kim's sister-in-law, this brother's wife, and he had died like 6 months before we arrived, but we conducted a ceremony of healing and reconciliation at that site. It was a very powerful experience for all of the Vietnam veterans that were with us, and especially for Kim's sister-in-law. So we say, well, we've always had warfare, and as I mentioned earlier, our United States has never gone longer than 6.5 years without being in an armed conflict within our borders or in an international community. Shelley Rambo, in her book, Resurrecting Wounds, Living Life in the Afterlife of Trauma, provides a lot of insight. And she wrote a journal entry for a Princeton magazine where she talks about the changing landscape of warfare. War used to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that end would take place with a surrender or a treaty. So we knew that this fighting was over. War now has become circular. We started with proxy wars. Vietnam was a proxy war. The real combatants were actually the United States, Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, and China. But it was fought in a third world country. That's called a proxy war. The circular war is much more difficult because it's unending. There's no national identity. Acts of terrorism are a weapon of choice. And if we think about it, the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda are comprised of people from different nationalities, but they are united philosophically and ideologically, and that is the enemy. But where do you declare war? If they reside in Pakistan as a place to hide out and launch assaults into Afghanistan, you cannot declare war on Pakistan because it's a terrorist organization that is housed there. The other thing that I've noticed is that when we do eliminate one group, the next one becomes more volatile and more toxic. And so war itself becomes cyclical. Now, let's put this in the context of our current conflicts. After Vietnam, there's no more draft. There's no more conscription. So a lot of our soldiers and sailors and airmen and that are all coming from volunteer forces, which is what people do. They volunteer for it. Because we lack the human power, the human resource in the active duty ranks, we activate the reserve units and we federalize the National Guard. So our citizen soldiers who are Ohio National Guard or Pennsylvania National Guard or Wisconsin National Guard, all of a sudden they find out they're in a rotation, a natural rotation to go into a war zone. Now, stay with me. The disconnect between what they go through in a war zone and what they come home to is reprehensible because the civilian community doesn't have much of an idea as to what they did. So let's say that one of our young men in the neighborhood who 19, 20 years old, trying to go to college, he also works part-time at a local grocery store stocking shelves. His unit gets called up to deploy in a combat deployment to Iraq. So he's going to be gone for a couple years, year and a half, 2 years or so. When he comes back, he's going to get that job working in a grocery store again. Do you think that's going to be the same young man that left 2 years earlier? He's different. He's been changed, and we've all been changed. And so the landscape of warfare has changed over the course of times. I can see, oh, this is fun. Wait, we'll get it. Okay. A brief history in the Greeks understood war as tragedy. The Greek hero in their writing is a tragic hero. In the United States, we understand our heroes as redemptive heroes. In Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, Ajax, Achilles, Odysseus, the warriors are tragic heroes and greatly afflicted and affected by their participation in war. They demonstrate in poetic form what we know today as post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. Our American veterans, we want to receive as redemptive heroes. because the redemptive hero is woven into the fabric of our American civil religion. The cause is right and just, and we have a duty to serve. This becomes our national belief and our national expectation that we can do no wrong. We can do no harm. But what the soldier or sailor or Marine or airman or airwoman understands is when they are put in a situation where they do violate this personal code of ethics or morals, that they're not a redemptive hero. They're living a tragic life now. And so one of the differences between post-traumatic stress disorder and the clinical outline within the psychiatric manual, the diagnostic manual, is when you are the perpetrator of that violence, you are dispensing trauma on other people. And so Dan Adams, and I quote this in my book, Soul's Cry, the soldier performs a service that carries significance beyond his or her concrete actions. The narrative is deeply rooted in American soil. Americans interpret their lives according to redemptive logic, and they interpret deaths and resurrections in light of the Christian story. This redemptive story has both sacred and secular versions, but it is nonetheless a core component of the idea of America. And I've found that to be the truth. That we may not have specifically religious holidays, but that civil religion comes out in things like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Flag Day, and any other day that we celebrate or lift up those who serve. They take on a religious kind of flavor to it. Well, what happens is the veteran themselves carries two stories. There's a story, the national story, that the nation wants to hear. And it's what story we want told about winning, about the cause of what is right, about saving people, etc., etc. There was a quote from the Vietnam story where one of the officers said, "We had to destroy the village to save it." The other story is about the truth of war, and that's the story that the veteran carries. It's about the young man who was at the ditch at My Lai. It's about the pilot who was ordered to drop ordnance in a place where he didn't know where it was going to land. It's those kind of stories. It's the Iraq soldier who is called out to go pick up the body parts of a fellow soldier who suddenly found themselves blown to bits, and his job is to pick up body parts and try to get them back into the same body bag. That's the story that we do not want told, and we don't want it to be part of our national story. So what does the veteran do? The veteran keeps that story inside, and it's told perhaps, or never told, at places like the American Legion or the VFW or the Disabled American Veterans or the Iraq-Afghan vets. It's a closed system. The civilian community never hears this, and the veteran's never going to talk about it. Another illustration I'd like to share with you. There was a grandfather, World War II veteran, who the family believed he was just an old curmudgeon. He was grumpy. He was an old man from the time they ever met him. No one could get near him at family gatherings such as Christmas or Thanksgiving or 4th of July. He had been in World War II, but he never talked about it until his grandson, who had enlisted, went to Iraq and came back as a combat veteran. The grandfather took this young man under his wing because now they had something in common that they could share with each other. And this is the story that the grandfather told the grandson. He had served in Europe towards the close of World War II. They had captured German soldiers. They didn't have enough transportation or room to take these German prisoners of war back to the prison camp. His orders were to execute those POWs. That's why the grandfather could never talk about it. Those are the kind of stories that many of our veterans carry inside. Where can they speak and be listened to? Where can they find healing? Listen, speak, and heal. Not too long ago, I was in a store in Charleston, South Carolina, and I could tell the store owner had a lot of military bearing. And so she was stocking shelves, and I said, "This is your store?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Wow, looks like everything's very neat and tidy." And I said, "Are you a veteran?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, thank you for your service." And she gave me a steely glare and said, "If you knew what I did, you wouldn't thank me." And I said, "Well, I apologize. I don't make it a habit to step outside." I said, "But what did you do?" I said, "I'm a veteran myself." And she said, "I interrogated prisoners at Guantanamo Bay." I said, "Say no more." I said, "So you're dealing with a moral injury?" She goes, "That's exactly what my psychiatrist told me last week." Stories we don't want told because we don't want to hear them. A young man at the age of 18 enlisted for the 82nd Airborne so he could get away from home, get out of his environment he was living in. Found himself in Iraq. In his first firefight, well, let me back up just a little bit. He was very close to his grandparents growing up. They were his anchor. Now at the age of 18 or 19, he's in Iraq. In his first firefight, they kick open the door of a house, and he points and shoots and kills the grandfather of the family. The grandfather was a non-combatant. In fact, I don't think there were any combatants inside that house. Now this young man is carrying the guilt of taking a grandfather from the family. He couldn't talk about it with anyone, anywhere. We were conducting a prayer purification lodge, and he was participating in that. This has been several years ago now. And the grandfather came to him in the lodge. And as we processed this and talked about it later, I said, "So what about that? You know, what happened?" He said, "The grandfather was sitting next to me, and he said, 'It's okay. I understand you were a frightened young man.'" He got forgiveness. You see, in Warrior's Journey Home, we believe in the spiritual connection because we are spiritual beings living in a human body and having human experiences, but it's also that we are spiritual and we connect with everyone who's living, everything that's living, but also those who have passed. And so you don't have to be a combat veteran to have a moral injury. The story here about Airman Brandon Bryant's story. After 6 years of working from a base in Nevada, sitting at a console with vivid scenes of Afghan and Pakistan villages 7,000 miles away, he changed his mind. His view about the morality of the operation changed when he saw a child vaporized on the screen and saw hundreds of people blown to bits. He walked away from a $109,000 signing bonus with a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder and a final kill count of 1,626. The number made me sick to my stomach. So here's the thing. What has been done cannot be undone. We have to live with that. But at Warrior's Journey Home, we believe that wounds can heal. We believe that the scar tissue within that wound, covering that wound, can remind us of where we've been and who we've become. The past becomes our teacher, not our master. Without healing, there is no need to even have a community to come home to. That spiritual healing is restorative in body and soul. And without community accepting responsibility, the veterans will continue to be solo victims. That the unspoken truth doesn't change a thing. It's when we can find voice in the ritual and ceremony and in the company of people who will listen with open hearts. I always like to think of people like Dr. Avon, you're the new shamanic healers. I don't know that they teach that in graduate school, but in my world, that's true. Veterans carry a pain that is not theirs alone to carry. It needs to be shared. So what does Warrior's Journey Home do? We create a community of veterans and civilians and the people we call strong hearts. The strong hearts are the ones who wait at home for someone to return. We've developed rites of purification and cleansing for the soul to heal. And those things are called the healing circles of trust, or they're called the prayer purification lodge that we conduct. There's other rituals and ceremonies that we conduct during different periods of the year as part of that civil religion. But it's not a glorification. It's not the national story that we want to hear. We allow people to embrace each other's wounds and to enter that wounded state. And in that, we find that healing that will begin to take place. The rituals and ceremonies create a strong crucible to contain the pain, the sorrow, the grief, the toxicity of events. We have trained facilitators to sit in that healing circle of trust and to guide that. But we are not therapists and we are not counselors. We are wounded healers. That prayer purification ceremony takes us deeper healing. And we now have a TP teaching for women, veterans, and the families and spouses. The word TP from the Lakota means to dwell or to live. And so when we enter into the TP and receive teachings and to conduct ceremonies in that TP, we're talking about dwelling again, by being alive again, by the soul recovery so that the body can live, so that we can be better men and women, husbands and wives, sons and daughters, better parents. Our ceremonies are an amalgamation of earth medicine, of Celtic spirituality, and other religious traditions that we pick and choose as long as they affirm life, and it becomes a warrior's journey home religious experience or spiritual experience. We believe that healing is possible, and from the warriors' experiences, they can contribute to the peace and renewing of life in the community. Veterans carry such great wisdom, because they've been not only in a life or death situation, but a kill or be killed scenario. And the pain that's associated with that. And they know that healing can happen. When I talk to veterans who have considered suicide as an option, I tell them that I cannot control what you do. But the reason you're still here is the Creator has something for you to do. Don't let the past be your master. Let the past be your teacher. We do apply the principles of forgiveness, atonement, restitution, and contribution. Forgiving yourself, forgiving others. In the Warrior's Journey Home system, our older veterans become our elders and guides, and they mentor the younger veterans. When we sit in a healing circle of trust and we have a man who served in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne sitting right next to a young man who served with the 101st Airborne in Iraq, there's a bond that takes place. And the elder Screaming Eagle can talk to this young man like no one else can. And he can listen to this young man because no one else can. So when we come home, we want to create a different society, a reformed society, and become more aware of the spiritual. And I think this dovetails very well with Dr. Avon's presentation on post-traumatic stress disorder, a clinical disorder. This is where, and this is a little blurry, but I think you can make it out. It's from the Huffington Post. Post-traumatic stress disorder and the moral injury share certain things in common, and there are things that are unique to each one. So post-traumatic stress has a startle reflex, memory loss, fear, flashbacks, all those things that we went through earlier today. The moral injury, which normally would manifest later in life, later in time, carries sorrow, grief, regret, shame, and alienation. And what they share together is anger, depression, anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, and self-medication with alcohol or an abused substance. When we sit in a healing circle, or when we sit in a lodge of prayer and purification, and we get to talk about what angers us, my question is always, don't talk about your anger, talk about what hurt you. Your anger is a response to a wound that you're carrying. Someone hurt you. Don't tell me how angry you are. Tell me what wounded you. And when we begin to talk about the wounding, then we begin to see the violation. We begin to see the betrayal, the moral injury. Do you think that young airman that we referenced earlier, do you think he was really feeling like he was a global force for good? But that's the story we want to hear. So I'm going to wrap this up and entertain any questions we might have before we move to a panel discussion. The references and resources is not an exhaustive list, but it's there. And I want to say thank you. Where'd it go? It just shot past. Okay, just want to say thank you. And I want to leave you with this poem by Major Michael Davis O'Donnell, Army aviator from Vietnam. If you are able, save them a place inside you, and save one backward glance when you are leaving the places they can no longer go. Be not ashamed to say you love them, though you may or may not have always. Take what they left and what they taught you were with their dying, and keep it with your own. And at that time, when people decide to feel safe to call war insane, to take one moment to embrace those gentle heroes you left behind. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Schluep, if somebody's watching this on our website, what can they do to become involved? What can they do to help their own community?
That's a good question. There's things we could do if there's not a Warrior's Journey Home Healing Circle of Trust close by. We can start one. They can contact us, and we can start from there. We do have, we go through a training protocol. We do have a vetting system for the leadership of a Warrior's Journey Home community within your community itself, whether it's through a church or through another organization. But we begin to work with a small core group and then branch out. The vetting process helps us get people who are serious about the work. It's not easy, it's very difficult, and as I stated earlier, we supplement and complement what we do through the trauma center and through the court and police, et cetera. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Warrior's Journey Home in the greater Akron area has a relationship with Valor Court of Summit County and with Valor Court of Akron, which is through the municipal court. We do have an awareness now with different police departments and sheriff's departments who, when they have a domestic call and there's a veteran involved, they may call us as a resource. And we've had educational programs within the community to raise awareness as to what people can do to bring our veterans home in that. So, and we do receive, every once in a while, we'll get someone referred by the VA because we are a grassroots organization and we are available without an appointment. We're not going to put you on a waiting list. And we do have certain criteria within the healing circles of trust. But it's, that brings up another thing, is that a lot of times some of the vets will show up at a Warrior's Journey Home Healing Circle of Trust, spend a few sessions with us, and realize, I got to get some help. And so they end up going to the VA. There's great mistrust with institutional programs. And when they're sitting in a healing circle of trust and they're listening to one of these older veterans talk about how the VA has helped them, it opens that door. And so instead of sitting around bemoaning how mistreated they are by an institution, they're hearing from someone else say, you know, I know it's not perfect, but it's helpful. So that's how we work with the community. Okay, thank you. We're going to take a break now and then set up for the panel discussion, right? Is that a thumbs up? Hard to tell. I thought that picture of Jesus back there was your thumb going up.